So, why is metaphor important to nonfiction prose? Why don't we just look at nonfiction prose in terms of objective, literal representation of facts? Um, well, there's kind of a more philosophical reason and then a more historical reason. Um, the philosophical reason is that life is always unfolding. So the reality that we want to represent in nonfiction prose is always incomplete. So if we pretended to represent it objectively, that would give it a completeness, an appearance of finality that it would not be true to reality, would be fictional. um, and that's the critique that Ian McGilchrist makes about language, the critique that he makes of the three L's: language, logic, and linearity. Um, these are tools that are very effective for um, breaking things down, seeing how they work in isolation from life, in a kind of clinical remove, but in controlled circumstances. The flow of life is characterized by chance, random accidents, chaos, that do not admit of definitive representation by in the three L's. This is what Edward St. Aubin suggests in the epigram to Barbarian Days. That just notice the use of metaphor in this sentence. He'd become so caught up in building sentences that he'd almost forgotten the barbaric days when thinking was like a splash of color landing on the page. We see a contrast between sentences, building, like manufacturing, versus the kind of vitality of color and the splash, but also the event. The splash of color is an event, like life. Sentences are static, but that flow of experience, the event of the splash, is something that we rely on metaphor, rely on various kinds of figurative language, which is to say poetry, basically, to evoke by comparison this unfolding of time, letting yourself think about the metaphor and see where it takes you. That's a movement, an experience. It's an event, like life. That's why we rely on metaphors to evoke real experience.
Kelly Slater, this 11-time world champion, just pulled back the curtain on a thing he's been developing for many years out in the Central Valley near Bakersfield, I'm told, an artificial wave pool. I mean, there are these artificial wave pools, these really kind of crummy simulacra of waves all over the place, but they've never really caught on because the wave isn't very good. Well, Slater's wave is really, really, really good. It's a quantum, many quantum leaps from everything that's ever been made artificially. This thing he's just revealed, and it's this beautiful, incredible machine-made, but just flawless wave. And of course, he makes it look incredible. But it's not open to the public. But he's had a few friends, other pro surfers come, and they make it look pretty incredible too. And so there's one part of the sort of surfing nervous system that says, I gotta have it, I gotta ride that wave, let me at it. And then there's everything else. And it's it's quite the existential question right now in a way in surfing, because they're gonna be able to replicate this thing, presumably just a machine, all over the world, and people are gonna be able to surf exciting waves, not just junk, everywhere, anywhere that they can afford these things. And what is it? What is it? And the weird thing is that Slater, for instance, is such a great surfer, and what you get when you watch him surf is, and this is surfers and even non-surfers. I remember my daughter was about 2 or 3, and as usual, kind of on my knee watching surf videos. Like, what are we looking at, Daddy? And we were just watching a video, and he came on among the other people surfing, and she just suddenly, her eye went to it, and she says, "Oh, he's that word again. He's so nice. He's so nice. Why is he so nice?" And I'd say, because he's the best surfer in the world. That's why. Anyway, when you see Slater, for instance, do some incredible thing in incredible ways, what often you're responding to is, how did he know that? He has amazing athletic ability, but it's what he knows about what the ocean is going to do and how he might react sort of creatively, aggressively, progressively, just like magically. His sense of the ocean is so deep, and that's true of the few most exciting surfers in the world. There's a guy in Hawaii named John Florence. Same thing. Right now, he's younger. You just watch him, and how did he know? You know, it's impossible from where he was to understand what that wave was going to do. I can't tell looking at it and how he's in it. But this machine wave has none of that. You know, you ordered it up, you dialed it in. It's just going to do what it does in this tank with a flat bottom. And so it's there's some way in which it's like, you know, theologically dead. I mean, it's just not, the ocean's not surfing. And Slater wouldn't argue that it is. But it's quite a challenge, you know. Oh, this is what you always wanted. But it's not the thing at all.
The uncanny valley is a term that was developed initially by robot makers that has to do with the uncanny effect that a humanoid or a puppet has when it gets somewhat close to live human appearance, but not entirely. So the sense of familiarity increases the more human-like up until a certain space. And there's this gap here where it's close enough to be disturbing. So I think that's an interesting way of thinking about the role of technology in our representation to one another. That it's not about just some natural standard. It's instead about what human likeness is like. It's an artistic construct. It's like a metaphor for human likeness. Like Zadie Smith said about becoming, you can't choose your parents, but you can choose whose children you are. When we communicate these visions of happiness or niceness, we are reproducing life, and that we decide who we are through how we imagine ourselves and how we pursue our lives. They're not positive, empirical facts, our lives, but things we fill with meaning through how we pursue meaning. So we reproduce life, we reproduce ourselves through how we communicate ourselves. Speaking of children,
I wonder, what will you tell your children was the reason to fail and leave them facing a climate chaos that you knowingly brought upon them? That it seemed so bad for the economy that we decided to resign the idea of securing future living conditions without even trying? Our house is still on fire. Your inaction is fueling the flames by the hour. And we are telling you to act as if you loved your children above all else.
Act as if you loved your children. What makes that so powerful is the use of precisely of metaphor, as if. She's not explaining, but she's shaming, like using the metaphor to shame, and at the same time suggesting that idea of learning from behavior. If you will learn from, act like you love your children, and then you'll learn how to love your children from acting like it. An aspect of political representation is this metaphor. Our representatives are sort of metaphors for us. There's an article about it in the New York Times about her outfit. The white pantsuit it has a long history of affiliation with the suffragette movement, women's rights movement, going back to the early 20th century. So speaking for or symbolizing those excluded from representation. So this it's a white pantsuit, like it sounds like ornamentation, style. Doesn't sound like objective representation of reality. What does a white pantsuit have to do with that? But in fact, I think she's speaking for, symbolizing with this, active symbolic solidarity. She's speaking for these people that have been excluded from representation for so long, and continuing insofar as sexism still matters. So in that sense, it's the opposite of mere ornamentation. It's kind of the most important kind of representation. It's getting at it's sort of the most crucial aspect of reality, because it's unspoken for. Finnegan uses the metaphor of a bird to evoke a new rhythmic physical texture of communication, a new kind of listening. So he says in Fiji, I loved watching people chat even when I understood nothing, which was often since they usually spoke Fijian. They seemed to have an enormous repertoire of gentle, intricate social expressions. They used their mouths, hands, eyes, all the usual communication apparatus, but also chins, brows, shoulders, everything. Watching people listen was even better. There was a lovely, widely shared mannerism that I couldn't recall seeing before, a slight, jerky shifting of the head from side to side, a constant cocking of the neck, notch by notch, the way a bird does. I read it as a gesture of extreme tolerance. The listener was continually resettling his mind at different angles in order to take in different speakers, different impressions, with maximum equanimity. We Kavalangis, I think that means white campers, provoked a visible speed up of this mental spinal repositioning, I thought, but that might have been paranoia. So this is fascinating. He's noticing a new way of noticing. He's noticing it. He's paying attention to a different way of paying attention. And I like how what he says here at the end about feeling paranoid, describing his own mind as a source of static, like noise, confusion, of being out of sync, physically out of sync, emotionally out of sync with the proper sort of wavelength of communication. I mentioned to you the story of the Crow chief Plentiku. His nomadic tribe were put on the reservation and divorced from their way of life. Their sense of cultural purpose and even sense of time were lost. And he said, after this, nothing happened. I also mentioned the idea of a vision quest. And he developed a new mythology for the crow based on the character of the chickadee bird. Chickadees mimic sounds, and I think it's another great example of sort of learning from animals embodied intelligence. Um, so, um, and learning, um, animals are good metaphors, absorbing what this uncomfortable, scary experience has to teach me, despite the fact that it's not entirely accommodating me, obeying my will or whatever. Um, so listen to this story about the chickadee. Young Pleniku's dream calls on him, and it gives him ethical advice that seems designed to help him survive the cataclysmic rupture that's about to occur. Become a chickadee. He is least in strength, but strongest of mind among his kind. He is willing to work for wisdom. The chickadee person is a good listener. Nothing escapes his ears, which he has sharpened by constant use. Whenever others are talking together of their successes and failures, there you will find the chickadee person listening to their words. Becoming a chickadee, then, is a virtue, a form of human excellence. One trains oneself by sharpening one's ears. One acquires the ability to learn from the wisdom of others. And after one acquires this character trait, a new form of excellence opens up. One can survive the coming storm. The lodges of countless bird people were in the forest when the four winds charged it. Only one is left unharmed, the lodge of the chickadee. Chickadee virtue called for a new form of courage, yet it drew on the traditional resources of crow culture to do so. The chickadee is big medicine. Talking about the idea of sort of distressed hope. It's sort of like those blues ironies, the singing about sorrow, the making a pleasure out of pain by communicating the pain, turning the pain into something to communicate. And I think another way of thinking about it is the sort of the inverted way of thinking about it. All these inversions are confusing. A positive fatalism. So rather than distressed hope, a positive fatalism. So finding, like, Alex Honnold says, or Emily Harrington said about climbing El Cap, that it represents a kind of mastery, like this accident of the landscape. And finding from the landscape, from this fatality, this accident of circumstances, I'm finding a absolute ideal. I think that's the idea of subculture, that it's grassroots. It grows up from idiosyncratic particular circumstances. That's true of subcultures, but it's true of life, it's true of life in general. This kind of fatalism kind of sounds negative, but we only get this one life. I think part of what I'm trying to suggest in this class, the idea of adventure, has to do with the value of accident, discovery. That, it's a cliche, but that's kind of what life's about. It's so easy to go through life and just think like, oh, my real life is coming later, or it's so easy to just sort of whittle away your time without realizing this is the only life I'm going to get. Every day is absolute in a sense. That's, Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence is that we have two sort of incommensurable ideas in our head, or this is sort of the left brain, right brain contrast again, that we have an idea of the absolute, or this everything, the whole, the cosmos, eternity, or whatever. We have that idea, and then we have the here and now, just the mundane moments ticking by. And they just seem to belong to different categories. So Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence is to say, just to, it's a sort of thought experiment. Think about, what if you had to live your life over again eternally? Would you invest, are you willing to live each moment eternally the way you're living it right now? And the lesson of that thought experiment is that that's already the case. That's practically the case. Um, each each moment is all you're ever going to get in terms of a chance to live that moment. So the eternal is always at stake, like that, Thoreau line, you can't kill time without injuring eternity. Um, and I think that applies to this idea of, choosing whose child you are. You can choose whose child you are. You can find your own absolute in the world, and what you make of the circumstances you encounter. So this is a great old pick of Emily Harrington and Lynn Hill, that mentor and inspiration for her goal, purpose in climbing. And again, all this I want to suggest about these adventure activities is that they're metaphors for life. That life in general is about is a challenge to kind of embrace these accidents, requires a kind of courage to find your absolute, your absolute sense of yourself, what you want in the more or less accidental circumstances you confront in life. In another section of the book, The Gay Science, that where Nietzsche talks about, first mentions the idea of eternal recurrence. And gay science, it's the term, it means joyous wisdom, and I think it's another way of trying to bridge the left and right brain in a way. Like, the left brain is so kind of science is so kind of dismal in its disconnection from, the passion of actually living. So what Nietzsche's after there is like, how can I want to make science joyous. I want it to contribute to life. And so he emphasizes this kind of idea of a positive fatalism, free in the bonds of thy sweet constraint. So the constraint of mortal life, mortality, of living in the world of accidents and unpredictability. But that's the gift of life, is to get to live in that sweet constraint. So he describes it here in terms of what he calls amor fati, the love of fate. He articulates it in the form of a New Year's resolution. So it's a matter of embracing the new day, the new year, each new thing. He makes it a sort of existential challenge to sort of embrace what comes, that, and to see that as strength, the courage to face what I can't control as that's my most, that is what makes me most powerful. That's what makes the world most beautiful. Finding oneself in the world. I want more and more to perceive the necessary characters in things as the beautiful. I shall thus be one of those who beautify things. Amor fati, let that henceforth be my love. I do not want to wage war with the ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not want even to accuse the accusers. Looking aside, let that be my sole negation. And all in all, to sum up, I wish to be at any time hereafter only a yea-sayer. I want to look at this idea of fatalism, positive fatalism, in Finnegan's Crossing the Line. He often, notice when he says, I found myself, he's often saying, I found myself thinking, I found myself saying, I found myself noticing. I think that indicates something like what I'm talking about in terms of positive fatalism, of like learning from circumstances. So just to get an idea of what I mean, I want to notice a couple examples of just the opposite. So uh, where Finnegan is discussing sort of white obliviousness to the predicament of black people in South Africa, a refusal to acknowledge the other, and narcissism being wrapped up in your only seeing, your own world. So this is a good example here. This paragraph, Dennis Herbstein's White Man We Want to Talk to You was an account of the 1976 uprising by a former South African correspondent for the BBC. The scene in question took place in June 76 in a white middle-class English-speaking high school classroom in Johannesburg, where a teacher was trying to discuss with his students the carnage then occurring 10 miles away in Soweto. The students' suggestion for handling the uprising: shoot them, kill them all, teach them a lesson. Their analysis: they're savages, they're straight out of the jungle. The teacher's attempt to explain black grievances met a wall of incomprehension and even self-pity. Teacher: it can't be very nice to have no say in the running of your own life. Students: we haven't either. No one listens to us. During the boycott, it's easy to begin to believe that the community was poised for insurrection. This was far from true. On another trip to Busy Corner, I was standing in a small family-run fish and chip shop where I often went for lunch. While I waited for food, I listened to the shopwoman gossiping with another customer. Have you seen Crystal lately? She dresses quite smart now she's got that job. I reckon they gave her a Barclay card. I reckon so. And she'll be able to buy whatever she likes on very good terms. She was talking about a washing machine or else a tumble dryer. I thought perhaps a motor card. Oh, look, the mister's waiting for his lunch while we stand here skindering. How's things at the high school, sir? Are they still boycotting? I said they were indeed. Shame. Oppression, I thought, was domesticating, and it was necessary to recall that most of the community still had its mind on Barclay cars and tumble dryers. Not that a major showdown was approaching. It was on the last day of April that the Prime Minister made his ugly threat. If the state is challenged and it hits back, it will use all of the power at its disposal. I found myself studying the glowering oval of his face in the newspaper, wondering what exactly he had in mind. It's pretty interesting, Barclay cards, the oval of his face in the newspaper. Normalcy and, chaos, terror, breakdown, revolution, can be so hard to distinguish. But what I think, this is like the line, crossing the line. It's like, it's a matter of breaking that shell of insularity, that domesticating, turning inward and ignoring, evading, denying the chaos, the, scariness of uncertainty. Finnegan also notices this insularity in himself. I think that's one of the best things about his writing is and one of the most powerful scenes in Crossing the Line also turns on this the racism of adults compared to children. Now this is during the boycott, and the police are surrounding the school, and Finnegan recounts this conversation he has with another teacher. I saw Ralph Pereira stick his head out of his classroom. I told my class to stay seated and quiet and went to confer with him. Pereira was an affable middle-aged science teacher whose company I usually enjoy. Today he looked grim and a little wild-eyed. Any sign of the storm troops? I asked, half kidding. Pereira stared at me. "What did you tell your kids?" I said I'd lock the door if the cops came. "Serious? They'd just knock it down." It was my turn to stare. Why? Why would they break into a classroom to get at kids who are just sitting quietly? They'll throw tear gas in. We'll throw it back out. What did you tell your class? I told them if the cops come, they should run in every direction. Pereira gestured across the fields. I was shocked. But the cops will chase them, and that's when they start shooting, when people run away. They're much safer in their classrooms. Pereira shook his head. I don't think you understand, Bill, he said. First of all, I cannot tell these children to just sit quietly and wait for the riot police to come in and attack them. And I'm sorry, but I don't think you understand how much these Boers hate these children. What would be particularly hateful about children. And I think it's childlike openness to the world and resistance to dogmatism. And on top of that, the potential for growth that children represent, that children represent not just themselves, not just their own identity, but a principle of growth, reproduction, interlacing, interweaving, social communication rather than segregation. So crossing the line, looking beyond the insularity, of what Ta-Nehisi Coates called the dream of a law and order, of an established justice, often relies on irony, a kind of not a pretense to, objective truth, but just a destabilizing of the fantasy, of the dream of achieved justice. So Finnegan quotes this ironic, disturbing, ironic albeit disturbing, editorial in the newspaper referring to the necessity from time to time to shoot people dead by the score as a consequence. It's a consequence of the system, not of defects of character or training on the part of men charged with maintaining law and order. It's a mockery, a shaming, sort of like mentioned about Greta Thunberg, acting as if you loved your children. It's just a restating of a premise of reality, of normalcy, restating of what's normal in a way to expose its instability, its untenability. This is the embodied dimension of politics, also in heartbreaking ways. I felt sorry for the parents who had to watch their children becoming members of this fervent and perilous new subculture. There was a tailor at a shop at Busy Corner, a man whose son was a Standard 9 student whom I knew slightly. I was in the tailor shop one afternoon during the third week of the boycott, having a pair of torn pants repaired, when the tailor suddenly asked me what I thought of the boycott. I said something about how it was all very interesting. The tailor harumphed. He was a stooped, balding man with very thick glasses. Oh, it's all very well, but I'll tell you true. I don't know what will become of these children, he said. They're becoming strangers to their own parents. They talk all this new language we never heard before and accuse us. They say they don't care about their education and they're not afraid of the police. They're becoming rude and foolish. Here are your trousers, sir. I took the pants from the tailor and paid him. He stared me in the face, and in his magnified, unhappy eyes, I saw more pain than I was ready for. My boy was doing well at school. He didn't give a hang about politics before. I wish someone would talk some sense into him. He won't listen to me. So the progressive, politics of Black liberation, it's not simply glory. The fate of pursuing liberation, which is basically that amor fati, that trying to find yourself in the world, is scary, and it involves a real part of that embodied fate is sorrow, grief, fear that's registered in the face of this man. What's at stake is is a kind of childlike learning, and it's not that it's not foolish. I think he's wrong, or I think that's something that Finnegan is exploring, is the wisdom within this youthful rebellion. Finnegan often mentions the political power of the sheer form of speaking, singing, discursive performance as a political agency in itself, totally independent of what is said, what the political opinion is. I think that's interesting to think about. What's political? We think of politics usually as like having a political opinion, rather than of doing, acting. And I think if you've ever participated in a march or any kind of political action, there's an interesting and again fatalistic value in the act itself of just being that's just consistent being there then, and participating. Gives you a new sense of identity, a new sense of yourself. So here's a couple examples. He says, speaking of the boycott, this refusal of classes, it was curious that their great activation, the students' great activation should have come in the form of a refusal, but it was wondrous to see the energies that refusal liberated. Student government, formerly a pallid bureaucratic exercise, was suddenly a vital reality. Most of the meetings were held in camera, but the extent of grassroots participation was obvious from the number of reports delivered to classes from various committees. It was democracy in action, full of pleasant surprises. Another beautiful passage emphasizes both the political agency, the progressive agency of children, the young people, in the eyes of their elders, and the efficacy of singing, or the specific, political agency of singing. So the night belonged, as usual, to the students. They explained the issues and boycott strategies to their parents. They put out the most affecting pleas of all the community at large to join the struggle, as they called it. Their self-confidence, their idealism were so impressive that you could literally see it bring tears to the eyes of their elders. And before the meeting broke up, several student speakers, in an effort to reassure worried parents, took the trouble to emphasize again the point that this was not 76, the year of a terrible crackdown and massacre. We know what we're doing this time, a frail boy from my religious instruction class declared. 1976 was reactive. That was just an explosion, a response to the government's provocations. This boycott, this uprising is proactive. It's as well planned and well controlled as we can make it. As if to throw a cloak of safety over this fragile sounding proclamation, someone in the back of the hall began just then to sing. In a high, clear voice, God bless Africa, and 700 voices immediately rose into the slow, beautiful Pan-African anthem of the liberation struggle. I love that metaphor. As if to throw a cloak of safety. It's again another example of building outward from the practice. Like the practice You find your identity from the practice. Sing the song, assume the cloak, walk the walk, and then your identity, your meaning will follow from your action, from your material behavior. So when Finnegan says at the start of chapter 41 that democracy in action is full of pleasant surprises, I think what he's getting at there is that democracy isn't about expressing opinions. Each person has their own opinion, so much as it's about mobilizing voices. Embodied mobilization, communication, activation of voice and a discursive community. So I was struck, for instance, by the way my class, 6A6, chose one of their least prepossessing classmates, a sickly, cozening boy named Myron, as their envoy to the school-wide Students' Representative Council. It was not easy for the Standard 6 student to follow all that was said at an SRC meeting, and some junior delegates apparently did not understand that they were expected to make a complete report back to their classmates. But Myron seemed to rise to the occasion. So it's not about an opinion, but instead it's about activating a discursive agents, giving bodies voice. Another example is a play that's put on by his students, 6A6, depicting the travails of a boy from the Platteland whose family had just moved to Cape Town. His new classmates refused to sit beside him, claiming they could still smell the cow dung on his shoes. He was thoroughly miserable. Then he saved one of his classmates from a burning building, and the other children came to see the error of their attitudes. Although a peroration about the need for the solidarity of the oppressed followed this drama, it was not the play's message per se that I found interesting, so much as the fact that it was conceived and staged by 6A6 in a spirit of cooperation and creativity that I never would have imagined my poor register class could muster. 6A6 seemed to have found through the boycott the solidarity it had so conspicuously lacked. All the children are proud to be in 6A6 now, Hester told me. The other classes asked to see our play. So I love that. It's not the play's message, it's the solidarity. So thinking about democracy again, not as, a sort of averaging out of the public opinion, but the mobilization of a public voice. Finnegan himself comes to recognize this distinction between, just having political opinions or understanding certain, having knowledge about political issues and a more embodied experience of politics and of political agency. He discusses it here on page 194 in terms of conscientization, which means consciousness raising, awareness raising. So they're during the boycott, they're having these awareness raising teach-ins that they also refer to as conscientization, raising political awareness. During the first week of the boycott, Jasmine had asked me in all earnestness if Sir was ever conscientized. Feeling silly at first, I had told her how when I was about her age, I'd been awakened to the immorality of the United States' role in the Vietnam War. No one in my class had heard of Vietnam, so I ended up telling them a long story about the war, about the anti-war movement, about student radicalism, and the political sociology of the suburbs where I grew up. They seemed to understand quite well how my political awakening, such as it was, led to rifts with friends who are not similarly conscientized, and how children even broke with their parents over the issue. But they were uncomprehending when I explained that for me personally, Vietnam was always a disembodied event, that in those days I didn't even know anyone who had been there. To these children, I realized, conscientization did not have to do with coming to understand something they saw on TV or read in the papers. It had to do with things happening in the streets, to their families and neighbors, and to themselves. And the pivotal experience that conscientized them were very likely to be violent. After all, which would make the greater impression on anybody, never mind a young teenager? A teacher's lecture on the United Nations arms sanctions, a self-conscious discussion of inferior education, or the violent hatred of the white authorities made manifest by guns, dogs, and tear gas. So looking at political agency as embodied doesn't mean, stridently, mindlessly, fanatically pursuing a political agenda, but really on the contrary, paying attention to the, particular circumstances of actual people, seeing politics as a function of actual embodied lives. This is expressed really nicely by Maddie, a student who Finnegan befriends, and maybe the best chapter in the book. It's a bit longer. The final chapter, of Crossing the Line, is about a trip that the two of them take together. So most Black people are just too busy just surviving to be politically active. A lot of others feel too vulnerable to get involved. If foreigners expect all Black South Africans to have exactly the same political outlook, they're just being silly and racist. They're not allowing us the diversity, the humanity that I'm sure they allow in their own countries. A kind of embodied education or knowledge is darkly suggested. Also on the next page, 219, when he describes the bloody culmination of a protest Black people staged in white shopping center. Many of our students took part in the disruption of the suburban shopping centers, but the biggest demonstration occurred at the Golden Acre complex in downtown Cape Town. There, some 3,000 pupils, after having brought shopping at the complex to a standstill, gathered in the Central Mall to sing freedom songs and refused a police order to disperse. In front of thousands of shoppers, they were attacked by riot police in camouflage with truncheons and dogs. An unknown number were injured, 76 were arrested, and the broken glass and spilled blood were not, for a change, all on the Cape Flats, the Black area. So that's chilling, because he's the way that's put. For once, the blood was in the white neighborhood, but it was still the Black people's blood. But it's registering. It's a physical testimony to systemic, structural, coercive power. The difference in coercive power, that making that blood visible in the white world matters. Another very dark episode that Finnegan recounts is part of the conscientization, the awareness raising sessions themselves, a lecture by his colleague Jacob, that ironically uses a kind of comedy to address violence. The highlight of the lecture was an extended demonstration of the techniques of torture employed by the security police. Jacob had personal experience of some of these practices since he'd been detained for 7 months without charges or trial in '76. There was the airplane. The prisoner was forced to hold his arms straight out at his side and rotate them and was beaten when he could no longer continue. There was the refrigerator, a very cold room into which a prisoner was thrown naked and wet for hours and sometimes days. There were hoods, electric shocks, fists, boots, truncheons, the wet cap, the helicopter, solitary confinement. There was starvation, sleep deprivation, suspension by the feet, suspension by the wrist, partial suffocation. There was the 10th floor windowsill at police headquarters in John Forster Square, Johannesburg, from which so many political detainees had jumped. As he relived all these nightmares, Jacob's performance reached its highest pitch of enthusiasm. He whirled and danced, acting out everything, playing all the parts in a high theatrical voice and laughing crazily. To my horror, his audience laughed right along with him. Jacob's lecture shook me, and not only because of the brutality he described or the idea, not true in retrospect, that our students somehow found torture funny. They laughed, actually, to relieve tension. It shook me because it made me wonder what I was doing. Some of Jacob's dates and figures may have been doubtful, but his effect on an audience was undeniable. He got to them. It was an old-fashioned, holy roller kind of speaking, more exhortation than education. Yet it worked, and it suddenly showed my own lecturing style, my careful pursuit of the precise phrase, the nuance of meaning, and what I found to be a very unfavorable light. Finnegan asks whether his academic approach is appropriate, and I think that question is just an inevitable part of being critical, self-critical, rather than dogmatic. And the point is really in politics, caring, for communities, caring for the public is the resistance to ideological simplification and violence, as epitomized by racism. And so being self-critical, self-questioning is a natural part, and something you can't turn off. But the point that I think what Finnegan is exploring in this chapter and throughout this amazing book, I'd really encourage you to read the whole thing if you're interested, is this experience of fatalism, of recognizing the physical embodied aspect of political agency, that there's something more than the academic side. There's something above and beyond that politics isn't reducible to the academic side. In the beginning of this, the chapter on the boycott, there are a couple moments where you see him saying, so I found myself, that like he gets caught up in the momentum of the boycott in a way that I think demonstrates the kind of fatalism I'm talking about. He says when the first day of the boycott, that he'd heard the word around among the students in the air for weeks. My younger students had pronounced it with a guilty relish. I'd privately doubted that they even knew what it meant. Now I saw differently. Students of mine waved excitedly from the midst of the marching column, as though they had just boarded a train bound for somewhere wonderful, and I was on the platform seeing them off. There was Hester, there was Serene, Oscar and Maraldia. I waved back and soon found myself murmuring along with the rollicking refrain, "Freedom is not free." So found myself singing along. This jubilant, organized defiance was easily the most exciting thing that I'd seen since coming to South Africa. It was nothing less than life raising up against death. It was also, for me, rather redemptively deja vu, for I found the badly aged battle cries from my own student days for the relevance in education and power to the people rang here in Grassy Park with a fresh significance. I love that. Like the significance comes from the circumstance. And when later that morning somebody produced a guitar in a classroom where several dozen of us students and teachers had gathered after the principal had dismissed school for the day, I found I could even link arms with my companions and sing Pete Seeger songs without feeling even slightly absurd. It was the sweet African lilt and twist that these kids put on the most self-serious liberal lyric. It's an actual physical, social mood, a resonance among bodies akin to that sort of dance of conversational dance among the Fijians that he described it, involving the whole body. And including the whole body in communication matters here, because this is about protesting violence. This is, communication about the body. And it's equally protesting a status quo that tolerated violence, that, or even legitimated violence. So it's equally a matter of protesting violence and asserting a new mode of communication. It's about inventing a new kind of body. It's kind of, going back to Frankenstein, which I discussed earlier. It's about forging a new kind of communication, communicating in new ways, but thereby, even more importantly, forging a new body. The body about which we're communicating and by which we're communicating is something new, to replace a status quo that tolerated violence. It's not so different from our own status quo.